This lesson is CSS3 Media Queries and the Future of CSS3. In this lesson, you'll learn how to begin creating a CSS3 media query in order to build the page layout for a mobile device such as the iPhone. Specifically, you'll take a look at some of the best practices for converting a two-column layout for desktop into a single-column layout for mobile. Before we begin, just a brief discussion of what a CSS3 media query is and what problem it solves. So the problem that media queries solve is the fact that we're dealing with many different size screens these days, from the large screen of a desktop all the way down to the smaller screen of a mobile device. A media query simply sends or serves styles to different screens. How does it do this? Well, the media query examines the capability of a specific browser or user agent, and then it sends it a style based on those rules or values. So for example, the width and height of the browser window can be detected, or the width and height of a device, or a device orientation, landscape or portrait, and even the screen resolution. So how can we put this into practice? Let's go ahead and take a look at our code. We'll go into the base.css file located in the Lesson12 folder, and we'll add a media query. Now the media query has a very specific syntax. It starts with the @ sign, and then we'll type the following. Media only screen and max width 480 pixels. So here is our empty media query, and we could translate this as the following. Here, this phrase, only screen, means we're simply creating a media query that will only target screen. The second part is equally important, max width 480 pixels. You can interpret this query as less than or equal to. In other words, we're creating a media query that will deliver styles for screens that are 480 pixels wide or less. So I'm going to be cheating a little bit here. I'm going to be copying and pasting code that I've already put aside into this media query. I'm going to take this rule here for the body, and I'm going to place it inside the brackets here of that media query. So this is perhaps the number one obstacle that most people learning media queries run into. This entire rule here for the body is nested inside this media query. So what this will essentially be doing is replacing any previously existing rules that apply to the page. Again, if we scroll up to the very top, we can see there are certain rules for the body. And simply what we're saying is serve this style to screens 480 pixels wide or less. And what are we putting in here? Well, we're actually changing the padding of the body, and we're substituting a new background image, in this case a smaller graphic designed for mobile screens. We're also going to put in another rule for the wrap ID. This will look something like this. What we've done here is we've added a width of auto to the wrap ID, and we've given it a margin top value of 80 pixels. Let's go ahead and look at this in the browser. So I'm going to go open up my browser. And if we reload the page, we can see nothing has changed at this point. However, what I'm now going to do is reduce the width of the browser window by changing the width. And at a certain point, when that browser window hits 480 pixels, the screen suddenly changes. And what happens? Well, we've added margins to the top of this page, and here's that background image that I was mentioning. And when it comes to using media queries, we have a couple options. We could create a media query that is used simply for different size windows on the desktop. So if your browser window is 1200 pixels wide, you might have one layout. If your browser window was 800 pixels wide, you might have another layout. And of course, if your browser window was 400 pixels wide, well, chances are your browser window isn't 400 pixels wide if you're on the desktop. It's certainly possible, as we can see here, but more likely, this is a design that will be used for a smartphone, like the iPhone. And so essentially what we're doing here is we're creating a design specifically for that screen layout. Now, let's take this a little further. I'm going to go back to my code. I'm going to take the following code here from my text. I'm going to copy these two rules that I've already created, main nav and main nav li, or list. So these will affect the navigation on that page. I'm going to copy that. And again, I'm going to place this inside the media query. Again, inside these two brackets. And let's just take a look at that code quickly before we preview it. So in the main nav section, which is the navigation bar at the top, we've overridden the existing height and told it to be auto. And more importantly, the list items that create the navigation, we've applied this rule: float, none, and width, auto. So this is a very common strategy for creating layouts for smaller screens. Floated elements do not work particularly well on smaller screens or in mobile browsers. And essentially what we're trying to do is create a single column layout. So almost all of your elements will have float of none and width of auto. Let's take a look at how this works by saving this and reloading our browser. So now we can see the navigation has no floating, and it's automatically being sized to its container. Essentially what you would be doing is going through the rest of the elements on your page and doing very similar changes, making float none and width auto. But we've got a couple other things that we can do. For example, this header section at the very top of the screen is no longer needed. So what we can do is create a specific rule that turns that off. Let's go ahead and create the following. You'll want to add pound masthead. And the declaration that you're going to be adding is display none. Oops, one too many brackets there. Let's go ahead and save this. And again, in our browser, we'll reload. And we'll see that that whole masthead section has now disappeared. Now, of course, if we expand that browser window again, our original layout comes back. Now, we would go ahead and we would continue with the rest of the elements on this page, essentially doing similar changes. I won't be doing that here, but there's one last thing that we need to take a look at. I'm going to go back to my media query, and let's look at that first line again. So what this line is saying here is only change the width for screens that have a width less than 480. What we're going to do here, just temporarily, is add the following: max device width. So what this line does is add a special rule just for devices that have a resolution of 480 pixels or less. Now what this will mean is that when we preview this in the page, there will be no change anymore because we're using a desktop screen, not a device. So if I reload the page, we no longer have that change. So what does this really mean? What this means is, in order to see your design on an iPhone, you should really put this page online and preview it from the iPhone itself. What we do here in the exercise is we use the original max width rule to give us a preview of what this will look like on the iPhone. However, this is just a stopgap measure. It's temporary. In the end, when you're done with your design, you're going to want to use the max device width property and then preview that in the iPhone. For now, though, this max width property is a good way to preview your changes and give you a sense of what this will look like on the iPhone. That's it for now. In this lesson, you learned how to create a CSS3 media query, and specifically, you looked at some of the best practices for converting a two-column layout for desktop into a single-column layout for mobile.